This is the story of how a man who could barely leave his bathtub became the most dangerous voice in Paris, how a woman who wanted peace accidentally unleashed terror, and how a single knife wound created a martyr so powerful that his enemies wished they'd never touched him. But to understand why Charlotte Corday's plan failed so spectacularly, we need to go back 3 months, to April 1793, when Jean-Paul Marat wasn't a martyr at all. He was a defendant. He faced charges of preaching pillage, advocating dictatorship, and calling for widespread murder. The evidence against him was damning. His own words, printed in his newspaper, calling for hundreds of thousands of executions to save the revolution. The punishment, if convicted, was death. And yet by the end of that day, Marat wasn't carried to the guillotine. He was carried through the streets of Paris on the shoulders of cheering crowds, a crown of laurel leaves pressed onto his head like a Roman emperor. How does a man facing execution walk out as a hero? And how does that same man just 3 months later end up bleeding to death in his own bathtub, murdered by someone who thought she was saving France? To understand any of this, you need to understand what France looked like in 1793. The revolution had begun in 1789 with idealistic promises of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. By 1793, that idealism had curdled into something darker. King Louis XVI was executed on January 21st, his head separated from his body by the guillotine in front of a crowd of thousands. The monarchy was finished, but what would replace it? 2 factions fought for control of the new government. On one side were the Girondins, moderate Republicans who wanted a measured approach to change. On the other were the Montagnards, radicals who believed the revolution needed to strike harder and show no mercy to its enemies. Jean-Paul Marat was the loudest, most extreme voice among them. And his weapon wasn't a sword or a gun. It was a printing press. His newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, or the Friend of the People, was the most influential radical publication in Paris. In its pages, Marat named enemies, demanded executions, and spoke directly to the working-class sans-culottes who formed the revolution's militant base. When Marat wrote that heads needed to roll, heads often rolled. But here's what doesn't make sense about the official story of Marat as a bloodthirsty demagogue. This was a man who had spent 11 years in England practicing medicine. A man who had published serious works on optics, electricity, and light. He had translated Isaac Newton's Optics into French. Jean-Paul Marat wasn't an uneducated mob leader. He was a physician, a scientist, and a genuine intellectual who had somehow become the face of revolutionary violence. And by early 1793, he was also a man in constant, excruciating pain. Sometime around 1788, Marat had developed a devastating skin condition. Modern historians and doctors have debated the diagnosis for centuries. The only relief he could find was by soaking for hours in a medicinal bath. He would set up a writing desk across the tub, a wet towel wrapped around his head, and from this strange, steaming office, he would write the articles that called for the deaths of his political opponents. The man calling for rivers of blood was himself trapped in a prison of his own inflamed skin. So how did this intellectual, this scientist in constant agony, become the hero of the Paris mobs and the target of an assassin? It goes back to his trial in April. The Girondins, his moderate rivals, were convinced that Marat's violent rhetoric had gone too far. They saw him as a dangerous anarchist and believed they finally had enough evidence to silence him for good. They put him on trial for his life. It was the biggest political gamble of the year, and it backfired completely. The trial turned Marat from a radical journalist into a symbol of the revolution itself. To the common people of Paris, it looked like a group of wealthy, out-of-touch politicians were trying to silence the one man who dared to speak for them. The Friend of the People was on trial, and so they felt, were they? On the day of his trial, the courthouse was mobbed by his supporters. They'd packed the galleries, shouting down the prosecution and cheering every word Marat spoke in his own defense. He argued that his calls for violence were necessary to protect the revolution from its enemies, both foreign and domestic. He wasn't a monster. He was a patriot, a watchman sounding the alarm. The jury, swayed by the public pressure and Marat's own passionate defense, acquitted him of all charges. The crowd went wild. They lifted him onto their shoulders, parading him through the streets as a conquering hero. The Girondins had tried to destroy Marat, and instead they had made him invincible. And in the city of Cannes, hundreds of kilometers from Paris, a young woman named Charlotte Corday read about these events with growing horror. A supporter of the Girondins, she saw Marat not as a hero, but as a monster who was personally responsible for the violence consuming her country. And as more of her political allies were arrested and threatened with the guillotine, she decided that if the government couldn't stop Marat, she would have to. She began to plan a journey to Paris. She had a new purpose. She was going to kill the friend of the people. Who was Jean-Paul Marat? To many, he was the monster of the French Revolution. The journalist whose newspaper, The Friend of the People, became the voice of the sans-culottes, the working-class militants who formed the revolution's base. When Marat wrote that heads needed to roll, heads often rolled. But the official narrative of Marat as just a bloodthirsty demagogue, it doesn't quite add up. This was a man who had spent 11 years in England practicing medicine. A man who had published serious scientific works on optics, electricity, and light. A man who translated Isaac Newton's optics into French, even while disagreeing with Newton's theories. Jean-Paul Marat wasn't some uneducated mob leader. He was a physician, a scientist, and a genuine intellectual who somehow became the face of revolutionary violence. And by early 1793, he was also a man in constant, excruciating pain. Around 1788, Marat had developed a devastating skin condition. Modern genetic analysis of bloodstains from his newspapers suggests it was likely a severe form of dermatitis, probably caused by a fungal infection and complicated by nasty bacterial pathogens. By 1793, Marat was spending several hours every single day immersed in a customized, shoe-shaped bathtub filled with medicinal water. It was the only thing that gave him any relief. Picture that for a moment. The most feared journalist in France, the man whose words could send aristocrats fleeing for their lives, conducting his political business from a bathtub. Receiving visitors in the bath, editing articles in the bath, denouncing his enemies in the bath. The bathtub wasn't a quirk. It was a prison his own body had built for him. And it was from this bizarre position of power and vulnerability that Marat faced his trial. On April 13, 1793, the National Convention voted to send Marat before the Revolutionary Tribunal. His enemies, the moderate Girondins, had finally found a way to destroy him. The charges were serious. Marat was accused of inciting pillage and robbery. He was accused of advocating for a dictator, a military tribune who could bypass democratic processes. And most damningly, he was accused of calling for mass murder. This last charge was hard to refute. Marat had written, in black and white, that perhaps 100,000 heads would need to be cut off for the freedom of the many. But the Girondins had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that putting Marat on trial would humiliate him, weaken him, and prove to France that he was a dangerous extremist who needed to be silenced. They forgot who they were dealing with. On April 24th, Marat entered the courtroom, not as a cowering defendant, but as a man on the attack. Rather than apologizing for his words or claiming he'd been misunderstood, Marat did something completely unexpected. He defended everything he'd said. Yes, he had called for mass executions. Yes, he had advocated for a strong leader. But these weren't crimes, he argued. They were necessary measures to protect the Republic from enemies who wanted to destroy it. The Girondins, Marat claimed, were the real traitors. They were the ones working with foreign powers. They were the ones who would sell France back to the monarchists. Every word he had written was in defense of the people, against the people's enemies. His defense was eloquent, passionate, and utterly uncompromising, and it worked. The jury returned a verdict that shocked the Girondins. Not guilty. What happened next must have been extraordinary to witness. The courtroom erupted. Hundreds of supporters who had packed the gallery rushed forward. They lifted Marat onto their shoulders and carried him bodily out of the building. Someone pressed a crown of laurel leaves, the ancient Roman symbol of victory, onto his head. Through the streets of Paris they carried him. The man who should have been on his way to the guillotine was now being paraded like a conquering hero. The crowds grew as word spread. Marat had won. Marat had beaten the Girondins. Marat was still the friend of the people. This was the moment that sealed his enemy's fate. And though he didn't know it, his own as well. Meanwhile, about 150 miles northwest of Paris, a 24-year-old woman named Charlotte Corday was reading about all of this in horror. Charlotte Corday came from a different France than Marat's working-class supporters. Born into a family of minor, impoverished nobility, she was a fifth-generation descendant of the famous dramatist Pierre Corneille. She had been educated in a convent where the library gave her access to the great Enlightenment thinkers, Plutarch, Rousseau, Voltaire. Corday considered herself a Republican, but a moderate one. She believed in the revolution's ideals of liberty and justice, but she was horrified by its violent methods. And no one horrified her more than Jean-Paul Marat. The previous September, Parisian mobs had stormed the city's prisons and massacred somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 prisoners, mostly clergy and political opponents. Corday blamed Marat directly. She believed his inflammatory rhetoric in The Friend of the People had incited the violence. Every new call for blood in his newspaper was another step toward destroying everything the revolution was supposed to represent. And now this man, this monster in her eyes, had been acquitted. He was more powerful, more celebrated than ever. To Charlotte Corday, Marat's victory was a catastrophe for France. He was a disease, and as his power grew, the Republic sickened. In her mind, an idea began to form. A terrible, decisive idea. If the law could not stop Marat, if the political system only made him stronger, then perhaps it was up to a single citizen to act. She saw herself not as an assassin, but as a patriot. Someone had to save the Republic from itself, even if it meant committing a final, desperate act of violence. Charlotte Corday began to pack her bags for Paris. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and fateful encounters of the entire French Revolution. The avenging angel from the provinces was on her way to meet the people's chef friend in his medicinal bath. And their meeting would change the course of history. Among Charlotte Corday's acquaintances were several Girondin deputies, the very political faction that had tried and failed to bring down the radical Jean-Paul Marat. The political situation in Paris collapsed completely in late May and early June 1793 when armed militants surrounded the National Convention and forced the expulsion of 29 Girondin deputies. Several of these deputies fled to Caen in Normandy, hoping to raise armies and march on Paris. Charlotte Corday listened to their plans, but she was developing a plan of her own. What happened from May 31st to June 2nd, 1793 was nothing less than a political coup. The Montagnards, led by figures like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, had grown tired of fighting the Girondins through legislative maneuvering. So they did something more direct. They mobilized the sans-culottes, tens of thousands of armed Parisian workers and militants, and surrounded the National Convention itself. The message was clear: expel the Girondin deputies or face the mob. Under literal siege, the convention voted to arrest 29 Girondin deputies and force the resignation of 2 ministers. The moderates were finished. The radicals had won. Marat was instrumental in making this happen. He had called for the arrests in his newspaper, The Friend of the People, and he had helped incite the insurrection. Now, in the aftermath, his faction controlled France. Historians often mark this moment, the fall of the Girondins, as the true beginning of the Reign of Terror. Everything that came after flowed from this seizure of power. And here's the irony that makes this story so tragic. Just as Marat's political power reached its absolute peak, his body was failing him. A debilitating skin condition that had plagued him for years was getting worse. By June and July of 1793, Marat could barely leave his bathtub. He was spending more and more hours submerged in medicinal water, trying to manage the constant pain and itching. His body was covered in sores. The physician who had spent years healing others couldn't heal himself. He conducted nearly all his business from the bathtub now. A wooden board placed across the tub served as his desk. He read newspapers, wrote articles, and received visitors, all while half submerged in water. Deputies from the convention came to consult with him. Sans-culotte leaders came to receive their orders. The Friend of the People held court from his bathroom. On July 4, 1793, just 9 days before his death, Marat made what would be his last significant political intervention. He charged that the Hebertists, an ultra-radical faction that made even Marat look moderate, were guilty of treason for attacking the Montagnard leadership. Even dying, even confined to his bathtub, Marat was still fighting. Charlotte Corday left Caen for Paris on July 9, 1793. She traveled alone. She told no one her true purpose. Her original plan had been dramatic, even theatrical. She intended to assassinate Marat in public, either during the Bastille Day celebrations on July 14th or in front of the National Convention itself. She imagined striking him down before the eyes of all France, demonstrating that the radicals were not untouchable, that one person with enough courage could change history. But when Corday arrived in Paris around July 11th, she discovered a problem. Marat hadn't been seen in public for weeks. The man she had traveled over 150 miles to kill was confined to his apartment, too sick to attend the convention, too sick to even appear at public celebrations. She would have to go to him. On the morning of July 13, 1793, Charlotte Corday visited the Palais Royal, a complex of shops and galleries in the heart of Paris. She entered a cutlery shop and purchased a kitchen knife with a 5-inch blade. It was an ordinary knife, the kind you might find in any Parisian kitchen. Nothing about it suggested its deadly purpose. Before making her attempt, Corday composed a document she titled, "Addressed to the French, Friends of Laws and Peace." In it, she justified what she was about to do, framing the assassination not as murder, but as a patriotic act. She wanted France to understand why Marat had to die. Marat's apartment was located in a district that was the heartland of radical sans-culotte politics. Getting inside would not be easy. Corday made her first attempt early on July 13th, sending a message requesting an audience, but she was turned away by the concierge. She tried again, but this time she was stopped by Simone Everard, Marat's companion and common-law wife. Simone was suspicious of this persistent visitor, a young, well-dressed woman from a different social class than the militants who usually came to see Marat. Why was she so insistent? Simone refused to let her in. But Corday had not traveled all this way to be stopped by a closed door. On her third attempt that evening, she changed tactics. She raised her voice loudly, enough for Marat to hear from his bathroom, and announced that she had critical information about counter-revolutionaries hiding in Cannes. Specifically, she claimed to know the whereabouts of the Girondin deputies who had fled Paris after the June purge. This was exactly the kind of information Marat craved. The Girondins were his enemies, organizing resistance against the government he had helped create. If this woman knew where they were hiding, he needed to know. Against Simone's warnings, Marat called out, "Let the woman in." Simone reluctantly led Corday through the apartment to the bathroom. The room was sparsely furnished. Marat lay in his distinctive shoe-shaped bathtub, the water clouded with medicinal substances. A wooden board stretched across the tub, covered with papers, an inkwell, and a quill pen. Even now, receiving a stranger, he was working. Corday saw a man who looked nothing like the monster she had imagined. He was wasted by illness, his skin ravaged by sores, his body half submerged in water. He was smaller than she expected, more vulnerable. But she had not come this far to hesitate. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes. Marat questioned Corday about the supposed counter-revolutionaries in Cannes. She provided real names of Girondin deputies who had indeed fled to that city. Marat listened intently, scribbling notes on his papers. Then, according to Corday's later testimony, Marat spoke the words that sealed his fate. Looking at the list of names, he said, "Good, in a few days I will have them all guillotined. More death, more blood, more heads rolling into baskets." While Marat was distracted by his writing, Corday reached beneath her dress and withdrew the kitchen knife. In one swift motion, she plunged the blade into Marat's right side, just below the collarbone. The knife sank deep into his chest. Medical observers who later examined the wound noted its precision. Whether by luck or some instinctive accuracy, Corday had struck something vital. Marat screamed in pain. He cried out, "Aidez-moi, ma chère amie! Help me, my dear friend!" And with that, one of the most powerful men in France was dead. The chaos that erupted in that small bathroom changed the course of the revolution. Marat, the friend of the people, was instantly transformed into a martyr. Charlotte Corday, the woman who believed she was saving France from a tyrant, was arrested on the spot. Her act, intended to end the bloodshed, only accelerated it, paving the way for the most intense phase of the Reign of Terror. And Charlotte Corday? She made no attempt to escape. She just sat there quietly amid the chaos, enduring the insults and the blows from Marat's neighbors, waiting for the authorities to arrive. When deputies from the National Convention came to interrogate her, she answered every single question directly and honestly. Yes, she had come to Paris to kill Marat. Yes, she had acted alone. No one had helped her. There was no conspiracy. The deputies didn't believe a word of it. A woman couldn't have done this by herself. Surely the Girondins, Marat's political enemies, had sent her. They ordered her transferred to the Abbey prison, the very same prison where, less than a year earlier, the horrific September massacres had begun. Over the next 3 days, Charlotte was interrogated 3 times by officials from the Revolutionary Tribunal. Each time, they pressed her, trying to force her to reveal her co-conspirators. Each time, she insisted she had none. The president of the tribunal, Montani, personally conducted 2 of these interrogations. He was convinced she was just a pawn in a larger plot. How else could a young woman from the provinces conceive and execute such a daring assassination? There had to be letters, secret meetings, something. Corday's story never wavered. The decision was hers. She traveled alone. She bought the knife alone. She entered Marat's apartment alone. And she killed him with no assistance from anyone. The tribunal officials found her calm infuriating. They expected her to break, to confess, to cry. Instead, they got dignity and an absolute refusal to implicate anyone else. Charlotte Corday's formal trial took place on July 17, 1793, just 4 days after the assassination. The courtroom was packed. People who were there noted her remarkable composure as she entered. They noted her beauty. And they noted that she showed no sign of fear, even though she knew exactly how this trial would end. The prosecutor presented the evidence. The cutler who sold her the knife testified. Witnesses from Marat's apartment described what they saw. The address to the French that Corday had written was read aloud, including the part where she called Marat the vilest of villains, who deserved to fall under the avenging iron. When asked to explain herself, she made no apologies. She declared, "I killed 1 man to save 100,000, a villain to save innocence. I was a Republican before the Revolution, and I have never lacked energy." When the tribunal asked what she meant by energy, she elaborated, "That resolution which is given to people who put their private interests aside and who know how to sacrifice themselves bravely for their country." Even Camille Desmoulins, a radical Jacobin, later admitted that her answers seemed to ridicule her interrogators. She was supposed to be the accused, but she sounded like the judge. Her lawyer knew the verdict was a foregone conclusion, but he mounted a defense anyway. He argued that Corday had acted from a pure, passionate love for her country. She wasn't insane. The careful planning of the assassination proved that. She wasn't part of a conspiracy. The evidence showed she acted alone. She was simply a woman who believed, rightly or wrongly, that killing 1 man could save many. It was an eloquent speech. It changed nothing. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty. The sentence: death by guillotine. Charlotte Corday was executed on the Place de la Révolution later that same afternoon. She was 24 years old, just 10 days shy of her 25th birthday. Accounts from the time describe her extraordinary composure at the scaffold. She showed no fear as she mounted the platform. When the executioner's assistant began to bind her feet, she initially resisted, thinking it was an insult. When they explained it was just procedure, she submitted with what one witness called a cheerful apology. As they removed her neckerchief, observers noticed a blush cross her face, the last color her face would ever show in life. Then the blade fell. What happened next became one of the revolution's most infamous moments. According to press reports, the executioner's assistant, a man named Legros, grabbed Corday's severed head by the hair and slapped it on the cheek. Witnesses swore they saw the cheek redden under the blow, as if blushing with anger from beyond the grave. Science would later explain this as a reaction of blood remaining in the facial tissues, but the image was powerful. It fueled decades of debate about consciousness after decapitation and cemented Corday's status as a martyr in the minds of those who opposed the Reign of Terror. In death, as in life, Charlotte Corday refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of her fear. The Jacobin leadership, meanwhile, immediately recognized the opportunity Marat's death presented. Alive, Marat had been unpredictable, chaotic, and difficult to control. He attacked his own allies if he felt they weren't radical enough. He was useful, but also dangerous. Dead, Marat was something far more valuable, a martyr. Jacques-Louis David, the most famous painter in France and a personal friend of Marat, took charge of the funeral. He spared no expense hiring the best embalmer in Paris. By the evening of July 15th, Marat's body lay in state at the Cordeliers Club, the Jacobin meeting place. David orchestrated every detail. The body rested on a bier lined with flowers, draped with the revolutionary flag. An oak crown, a classical symbol of civic virtue, was placed on his head. The funeral procession that followed was a masterclass in political theater. It blended classical Roman mythology with the new secular religion of the revolution. It was, in effect, a canonization without a church. But David's greatest contribution to Marat's legend didn't come from the funeral but from his studio. In the weeks after the assassination, he created what would become one of the most iconic paintings in history, The Death of Marat. The painting depicts Marat's corpse slumped over the edge of his bathtub, his head thrown back, his right arm dangling toward the floor. In his left hand, he holds a letter, supposedly the one from Corday, that lured him to his death. In his right, he still clutches a quill pen, a symbol of his work as a writer and a voice for the people. The knife lies on the floor. The wound is visible but not gruesome. David deliberately minimized the blood, transforming a brutal murder into a scene of noble martyrdom. The composition is heavily inspired by centuries of Christian art. Marat is positioned like Christ taken down from the cross, his body arranged in a pose of sacrifice and suffering. David took a man who had called for the deaths of thousands, a man reviled by many, and transformed him into a secular saint, a holy martyr of the revolution. It was a propaganda masterpiece that shaped the memory of Marat for generations to come, proving that in the battle for history, the artist's brush can be as mighty as the assassin's knife. A famous painting of Marat's death called for hundreds of thousands of executions and turned him into a secular saint. It was unveiled to huge acclaim, and copies were spread all over France. Marat, who was so unpredictable and chaotic in life, became much more useful to the Jacobin leadership in death. And this is where the full tragic irony of Charlotte Corday's assassination comes into play. She killed Marat to stop the bloodshed. She believed that by silencing the loudest voice calling for violence, moderate forces could regain control. She dreamed that without Marat, the revolution might return to its idealistic roots. She was catastrophically wrong. In the month before Marat's death, the Revolutionary Tribunal issued a relatively small number of death sentences. In the month after, that number more than doubled. The assassination hadn't weakened the radicals. It had energized them. The Jacobin leadership used Marat's martyrdom to justify everything that came next. His death, they argued, was proof of a vast conspiracy by their enemies. If the enemies of the revolution were willing to assassinate the friend of the people, then clearly the revolution needed to strike harder, move faster, and show no mercy. On September 5, 1793, less than 2 months after Marat's death, the National Convention made a chilling decree: terror is the order of the day. The reign of terror had officially begun. The statistics tell the story. By the end of 1793, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris alone had issued 177 death sentences, a dramatic jump from earlier in the year. But that was just the beginning. By the time the terror ended with Robespierre's fall in July 1794, the Paris Tribunal would issue around 2,639 death sentences. And that was just Paris. Across France, another 10,000 or more people would be executed without trial or die in prison. Charlotte Corday had believed that killing one man could save 100,000. Instead, the man she killed became the symbol that justified the deaths of thousands. Some of Corday's own allies understood this immediately. One of her friends, a Girondin deputy, later wrote bitterly that if Corday had asked him for advice, he wouldn't have pointed her toward Marat's heart. He understood what she couldn't have known. Marat was more dangerous dead than alive. The unpredictable journalist could be managed, even controlled, while living. But the martyr was beyond anyone's control. David's painting hung in the halls of power. Marat's name was used to justify every new arrest, every new execution, every new wave of revolutionary violence. The friend of the people was gone, but his ghost demanded blood. What about Simone Everard, the woman who tried to stop Corday at the door? She survived the terror. She stepped back from politics after Marat's death and lived quietly with his sister. Marat's family even formally recognized her as his widow. In a surviving declaration, his siblings wrote that they were fulfilling their brother's wishes by acknowledging her as their sister. It was a small moment of humanity in a story otherwise defined by violence. Marat and Corday left opposite, yet strangely mirrored, legacies. To radical revolutionaries, Marat remained a martyr who gave his life for the people. Statues were erected, streets were named after him. Bizarrely, the bathwater he died in became a kind of secular holy water. But to moderates, conservatives, and anyone horrified by the terror, Marat represented everything that went wrong with the revolution, the dangerous extremism that turned idealism into mass murder. Corday's legacy was just as divided. The radicals despised her as an assassin. But over time, especially as the horrors of the terror became undeniable, she was reimagined as a heroine. More than 50 years after her death, the writer Alphonse de Lamartine gave her the nickname, the Angel of Assassination. She had completely failed in her mission, but she had faced her own death with extraordinary courage, and for some, that was enough. This brings us to the question that has haunted historians for 2 centuries. What if Charlotte Corday had never gone to Paris? What if Marat had lived? He was already dying, his body consumed by disease. He could barely leave his bathtub. How much longer could he have stayed politically relevant? Some historians argue that Marat's death actually removed a destabilizing force from Jacobin politics. His unpredictability made him a liability to his own side. David, the painter, knew exactly what he was doing. But constructed or not, the image worked. It still works today, more than 2 centuries later. It's the first thing most people think of when they hear Marat's name. Charlotte Corday stood before the Revolutionary Tribunal and said she killed one man to save 100,000. She was wrong about the saving. But she was right about one thing: her act mattered. Not in the way she hoped, not in the way anyone expected, but it mattered. It changed the shape of the revolution. It created a martyr. It gave the terror its most powerful symbol. And it showed something that revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries have rediscovered again and again throughout history. Violence, once unleashed, does not follow the intentions of those who wield it. It has its own logic, its own momentum, its own terrible hunger. Marat called for blood and drowned in it. Corday struck a blow for peace and paved the way for slaughter. The revolution ate both of them, and thousands more besides. 3 months after Marat's death, on October 16, 1793, another famous figure would mount the steps to the guillotine. A woman who had once been the most powerful person in France. A woman who had watched the revolution destroy everything she loved and who would face her own execution with the same strange composure that Charlotte Corday had shown. Marie Antoinette's final days make Marat's ending look gentle by comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most dramatic moments.